the issues affecting Asia's animals, and the stories of the people working on their behalf. We'll be taking you on a tour of what's been happening lately in the animal protection space around Asia, and also bringing you updates from our huge network of animal protection organizations and our many working groups. Welcome to the Asia for Animals podcast.
Welcome to All About Macaques, brought to you by the AFA Macaque Coalition, or MAC. I'm Brooke, MAC's lead coordinator. I'm also the AFA Coalition's deputy CEO. Today, we're going to talk about long-tailed macaques, monkeys who can be found across Southeast Asia and who are probably the most heavily exploited primate species on the planet. Although they're often seen in or near human-inhabited areas in large numbers, the species is actually endangered as a result of their exploitation. Despite this, they're in great demand worldwide, and this demand doesn't seem to be diminishing. Our guests today are Dr. Malene Friis Hansen, Head of Science and Research at the Long-Tailed Macaque Project. Malene is also an Associate Research Scholar at Princeton University. And we're also going to be speaking with Dr. Mark Jones, Head of Policy for the Born Free Foundation. Malene and Mark, can you please briefly introduce yourselves and your involvement or history with long-tailed macaques and related issues?
Sure. I'm Malene Friis Hansen, and I'm the Head of Science and Research at the Long-Tailed Macaque Project, also the co-founder. And I am a Associate Research Scholar, I think it's called, with Princeton University. I've worked with long-tailed macaques for a long time. Started with working with them in captivity in a zoo, and later on in rehabilitation and reintroduction. Then from there on, moved on to research. So did my PhD on long-tailed macaques, long-tailed macaque ecology and conservation in East Java in Indonesia with the University of Copenhagen and Copenhagen Zoo, and just learned a lot from them through many various channels, so in captivity and free-ranging and in free-ranging populations, and have seen a lot of what goes on with the long-tailed macaque, and that's why I still work with the species today.
Great, thank you. And what about you, Mark?
Yeah, well, hi, Brooke. Hi, everyone. My name's Mark Jones. I qualified as a vet in the UK. I'm from the UK, and I qualified as a vet back in 1985. So I worked as a vet for a number of years, general practice vet, and then did postgraduate studies in both aquatic and wild animal health and welfare. And I had experience working in wild animal rescue and rehabilitation centres, initially in South America and subsequently in Asia, specifically in Thailand, where I worked with many primates that were largely victims of wildlife trade or victims of conflict with people of one kind or another. And in Thailand, I worked with several macaque species, including longtails, stumptails, and pigtails. For the past 17 years, I've been in the NGO sector working in wildlife policy, with a strong focus on reducing the impact of trade and trafficking on wild animals and wild animal populations, including primates. And for the past 10 years, I've been at the UK-based international wildlife protection and animal welfare charity Born Free, where I'm currently head of policy.
Great. So now about long-tailed macaques themselves. Malene, can you tell us just a little bit about this species and who they are and what's kind of unique or special about them?
Well, all macaques or primates or animals are special, but everyone is. But for long-tailed macaques, they are called long-tailed macaques because of their very long tail that is longer than the head and the body combined. And they often have it over their head to help with balance, and that's where you can really see the length of the tail. They are extremely innovative, they are intelligent, have great cognitive abilities, they are able to coexist with humans and to utilize human resources, and that's also why they are successful in some areas of surviving anthropogenic changes. But in other areas, the pressure can, of course, become too high, and then they're not able to utilize and to survive in those habitats. But they thrive in various different habitats, from mangroves to beaches to rainforests to urban city centers. You can find them in many different places, and that is really one of their main skills, is their adaptability and adjustability to changes in their environments, and also very, very social.
Yes, okay. All right. And so what sort of threats or challenges do they face, both as populations, as individuals? I'd like to hear from Mark and Malene both on this.
Well, as Malene has indicated, long-tailed macaques are amazing primates, one of about 24 species of macaque, but they're geographically quite widely dispersed across Southeast Asia, from Myanmar in the east to the western edges of the Philippines and Indonesia. And there are about nine subspecies, I believe, that are spread across 11 or 12 countries in Southeast Asia. They've also been introduced into several countries, including Mauritius, Palau, and Papua New Guinea. However, like so many other species, habitat destruction, habitat conversion, and the fragmentation of their habitats into smaller and smaller pockets by people, and because of people's activity, is beginning to restrict the suitable habitats that are available for long-tailed macaques. So that's a big threat to them. And the species has a preference for forest edge habitat and can survive and thrive. They're very, very adaptable. They're highly intelligent, and they can survive and thrive in human-dominated landscapes. However, this can also result in the animals being highly visible to people, and that creates a false impression of them being present in very, very high numbers across their range, rendering them particularly vulnerable to exploitation and persecution. And they're widely regarded in some parts of the range as pests, so they're frequently culled in large numbers. They're also collected, live macaques are collected to supply very large breeding farms or sold directly into trade for use in the biomedical and pharmaceutical industries for research and testing purposes, and we'll no doubt talk in much more detail about that, or to be sold directly into trade for as pets or whatever, and they can fetch high prices. So this is another threat that's really emerged in recent decades, in addition to the threats from loss of habitats and the fragmentation of the home range.
Okay, Malene, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think Mark covered it very well. And so I think it's just important to say that there are many different threats to the species. They experience some of the same threats as any wildlife species today, but on top of that, there is the persecution and there is the capture for trade. And on top of being one of the most traded primate species illegally, it is probably also one of the most traded animal species illegally. So also one of the most trafficked ones. So there is an abundance of threats to the species.
Okay. So, and what sort of protection do they have? And what sorts of additional protections do they need? Internationally, nationally, or anywhere? Do they have any protections anywhere?
Well, they do. They do. So in many countries in Southeast Asia, all wildlife species are actually protected. So, for example, Cambodia, the Philippines, there's a lot of different, Vietnam, there's a lot of different levels of protection for wildlife species, but in general, they are protected. So you're not allowed to hunt and capture. But then there are different levels and different ways of interpreting those protective statuses. Some areas or in some countries, they are protected if they are inside a national park, because national parks are protected areas, so you're not allowed to hunt or capture anything within a national park. So as long as they're inside a national park, they are protected. That is actually also the case in, for example, Indonesia, where they are not on the protected species list. They are protected in protected areas, but not outside. And due to this behavior and adaptability of the long-tailed macaques, we often find them outside of protected areas, actually possibly mostly outside of protected areas. And they often do not have protection in those areas. So that is definitely a problem. And with the endangered status from the IUCN, that is, an international guideline. But every country decides for themselves where they think or how endangered a species is in their country and how it should be protected. So in general, I think the species is facing some issues with protection, and in the areas where they are actually protection, there might be some issues with enforcing the law.
Mark, do you have anything you want to add to that? I mean, we can talk about CITES. I know you've just been at the CITES meeting, for example.
Yeah, I mean, all primates enjoy some level of international protection against international trade, cross-border trade, through their listing on CITES, and that's the Global Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Long-tailed macaques are listed on what's called Appendix 2 of CITES. So what this means is that from an international perspective, cross-border trade in long-tailed macaques or parts and products derived from them across, from one country to another is allowed for commercial purposes, but it's regulated through a permitting system. And that permitting system is designed to try and ensure that the trade is legal and sustainable. Basically, exporting countries have to declare the source of any animals for export, confirm the legality of how those animals have been acquired, and make what's called a non-detriment finding to confirm that any extraction of the animals from the wild won't be detrimental to the conservation status of the wild population. But it's really important to realise that CITES only regulates international cross-border trade in listed species and doesn't have any influence over exploitation or protection at a national level. So as Malene has pointed out, the protection that these animals have within their home countries varies. It varies depending on the country, but it also depends on where those animals are located within the country, often whether they're inside or outside a national park. And as we've indicated already, in some Asian countries, long-tailed macaques are considered a pest species and are sometimes subject to widespread persecution and culling, particularly when they exist outside protected areas and where they come into close contact with people. There are some other rules which some countries apply, which can have impacts for the legal protection of long-tailed macaques and other species. For example, the US has some quite progressive wildlife legislation, which includes something called the Lacey Act, which allows the US government to take legal action when animals or plants are taken illegally from their country of origin and placed into international trade. So there are some other regulations in some countries that would afford this species and others some level of protection, but it does. The degree that protection is actually effective in preventing unsustainable offtake or persecution of this species varies enormously.
And also to add to that, for some countries, they actually, even if the species is not protected, they do have capture quotas. So there shouldn't be, for example, in Indonesia, you actually have to produce a wild capture quota every year, and that is the only amount of animals that is allowed to be caught from the wild. So that also exists in different countries to also make sure that you adhere to the Appendix 2 rules of CITES in terms of what you are breeding and what you're exporting and everything. So there are different other national legislation in place, but yeah, it's up to the countries, that's difficult to regulate internationally.
So it sounds like you would think that being super adaptable would be a gift to any animal species, because that means that they don't just die out as soon as people start fiddling with their environment or whatever. But in a certain sense for them, it's quite a curse as well, isn't it? And I'm wondering if either of you know of any other animal species that is both officially endangered and considered to be pests, culled, persecuted on such a degree. Does that exist in any other animal species?
Not to that degree that I know of. The pigtail macaque is also listed as endangered and is also persecuted in some areas, but definitely not to the extent of the long-tail macaque. The pigtail macaque is also traded internationally, but again, not to the extent of the long-tail macaque. The rhesus macaque is definitely facing a lot of issues that are similar to the long-tail macaque, but because the trade level of that species was India stopped exporting rhesus macaques many years ago, so that enabled breeding centers to kind of start breeding them, and today those are mostly captive bred individuals that are used in trade. But I do know that some of the protection to rhesus macaques have been lifted in India, which could then become an issue later on for rhesus macaques to the same level of the long-tailed macaque.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, I think we're generally very focused in terms of our efforts to protect species on those species that aren't particularly adaptable and become endangered or critically endangered. But we're not so good at recognizing the need to protect species that are more adaptable, particularly those that are able to adapt to live alongside us, which often end up getting regarded as pest species. And I think one of the sort of curses is, I think the word you use that affects the long-tailed macaque is that they do have preferences for forest fringes, and they do adapt quite well to living in human-dominated landscapes. And because of that, people who've travelled to areas of the world where long-tailed macaques exist may have experienced this. There can be an impression that they're abundant because they're visible. You know, you can see them, and they can exist locally in quite large numbers, very close to human settlements and in amongst people, particularly on forest edges. So that gives the impression that they're a very abundant species. Whereas, in fact, and again, I'm sure we'll be talking about this, there's real concerns that the populations are declining very, very rapidly across much of their range. So in that sense, I think that, there's been a failure of authorities and governments in the countries in which they exist to recognize that the species is in fact in serious decline, and a tendency to treat them as a pest species and persecute or cull them in some cases, or feel that it's okay to take large numbers of them out of the wild for, stocking breeding farms or whatever, on the assumption that this isn't going to affect the wild populations, when in fact it can have a very dramatic effect. So I think in that sense, your sort of reference to this as a bit of a curse is quite relevant here.
Okay, well, I'd like to talk about how a species becomes endangered, as in is recognized as such. And I know that it was only, about 2 years ago that long-tailed macaques were recognized as endangered. And Malene, you had a part in that process. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So in terms of how you work with the IUCN Red List, there's the IUCN, so International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and then there's a Species Survival Commission under the IUCN. And under the Species Survival Commission, we have different specialist groups for the different groups of animal species. And I am a part of the primate specialist group, more precisely, mostly the section for human-primate interactions. And, well, it's the specialist groups that lead the IUCN assessments. But anyone, can try to assess a species. They just need to get in contact with the Red List authorities for the different specialist groups. And some years ago, many years ago, when I started to work with species, I started to work with Augustine Fuentes as well. And we started discussing that it didn't seem sustainable what was going on. There seemed to be a decline in the species. For my PhD, I also did the assessment, kind of trying to see, okay, if we look at the groups on the forest fringes and we extrapolate that number, so we kind of use a wrong methodology, of biased one, a flawed one, then we extrapolate that to the entire forest, and then we compare that to a true assessment, then it was 20 times higher. So it was, we tried to use all the different methods that we'd heard about, and then we could see that something was definitely wrong. And back in 2011, Michael Gommert, Lisa Jones-Engel, and Augustine Fuentes published a book. They were the editors of this book, which is a compilation of different assessments from different areas. So that also, really put the species on the spot and said something is not right with the species. There's a decline, there's a lot of persecution, there's a lot of trade. We need to look more into the species. And also, of course, Ardith Udy back in 2004 and 2008, had some publications where she also expressed that, there are definitely problems with the species, the problems the species is facing. And she also brought that up at the 2008 International Primatological Society conference back in Edinburgh in 2008 at the top 25 most endangered primate species. She brought it up there, and it became the first widespread and rapidly declining species. So that was kind of something they came up with at that spot, because they couldn't say it was one of the most endangered, but they definitely could assess that something was wrong and we needed to do something. So there's been a lot of trailblazers along the way. Of course, there's Sarah from Action for Primates as well. That's been really advocating for the species for a long time. And so there's a lot of different individuals that have been putting it out there, and Mark as well, through the Society's work. And, a lot of individuals putting it out there that the trade is unsustainable. We're seeing declines. We don't believe the numbers that some people are producing. And then when we then created the Long-Tailed Macaque Project back in 2021, we sat down, a lot of different researchers, and kind of started discussing, and we contacted people out in the different areas of the different subspecies of the species. So it's very important to know that the Long-Tailed Macaque Project is a capacity building project, which means that I'm not the one who's doing the data collection. So all data collection through the project is done by local researchers and local NGOs. So this is people, very talented researchers who are on the ground. It's not me doing it from my desk in Denmark. And so we really have a lot of information to base the assessments on. We started with assessing the different subspecies, so the 9 subspecies, and looking into them and contacting people who were on the different islands. And we handed in those assessments to the IUCN Red List. And now, because some of those, actually quite a few of those, were then assessed as critically endangered, then the IUCN Red List came back and asked, can you please do a new assessment of the species because of the assessments of the subspecies? So we sat down and then again, contacted people out in the field, and then it took a long time. It was a long time of networking, communication, meetings, and assessments to try and figure out what is actually going on with the species. And created an assessment and handed it in, and it was accepted. And it became an endangered A3CD, so endangered with a projection of a 50% decline in the population size over the coming 3 generations. Also, what became apparent while we were doing this is that there was still a lack of information. So we were seeing a lot of different things, but we only had data from a few sites. Now, the IUCN Standards and Petition Committee have, just produced their ruling from the petition that we're going to talk about. And it clearly states that the results that we handed in back then showed that the species is actually endangered according to the Red List criteria. But we still thought that, more data is needed. We need to know more. And that's what we've been working on for quite some years now. There's now a lot of publications that the Red List Authority can use for the reassessment of the species.
Okay. Wow. Well, so we did kind of talk about how people in general kind of know what endangered means, but the specifics of long-tailed macaques, A3CD, you explained that a little bit there. So that, I think people sometimes have a hard time believing that if they go someplace and they're surrounded by like a group of 1,000 monkeys, that they couldn't possibly be endangered. But as you explained, that's not the case. It's the rate of disappearance, really, isn't it? It's not the current population size.
Well, that depends. So there's a lot, there's a huge guideline on how to use the IUCN Red List, and there's a lot of different criteria. And I think that the culture, if we can say that, but the way that we've been brought up in terms of understanding if an animal is endangered or not is more that if we can't see it, then it's probably endangered. If we can see it, it's probably not. And that's it's so deep within us. And it's deep within all of us. So then when people see that the long-tailed macaque is assessed as endangered, that can't be, I just saw it. But the criteria can be used in many different ways. And it's very important to remember here that the IUCN Red List was not set up to act once it's too late. It was set up for us to be able to act before it's too late. And I think that's very important, that this is how we start to use the IUCN Red List, that we think about, okay, we're at a level now that does not seem sustainable. If we act now, we might be able to change the pace in which the decline is happening, and we may be able to mitigate some of these threats, and then ending up with a population, a healthy population that might be in a better balance. And that's really what we are working for with the long-tailed macaque. We're trying to stop this before it's too late, and then hopefully we can change things, and then it does not need to be listed as endangered. But what we've seen so far is that most people use the criteria of population size, which is also a possibility. One of the subspecies, for example, Condorensis, is assessed according to critically endangered, according to population size, I believe. So there are different ways of doing this. But for the long-tailed macaque, we saw many different threats and high levels of threats. And because of the habitat degradation and levels of exploitation, we estimated that over the coming 3 generations, the long-tailed macaque would decline by 50% if we do not mitigate the threats and protect the species.
So, as we've established, the endangered listing doesn't automatically translate to protection, but it's like a first step. However, long-tailed macaques being declared endangered did seem to cause quite a stir with certain users of long-tailed macaques. And because of this, they mounted a challenge to the endangered status. And I was wondering if you can tell me a little bit about how that went and where that process is presently.
Sure. So more than a year ago, there was an informal petition first to the assessment that we responded to. And then there was a formal petition to the assessment. So the informal petition went to the primate specialist group, and then the formal petition went to the IUCN Standards and Petitions Committee. And they have then deliberated for quite some time in terms of what is going to happen with this petition. And the petition came from an association of different end users of long-tailed macaques. And the ruling just came from the IUCN Standards Petition and Committee, or Standards Petition Committee. And it says that the data shows that the species is endangered, but that a new reassessment has to be conducted. And they listed what needs to be done for the new assessment. So I think that's not a problem, because they do clearly state that it's endangered. So it's just a matter of rewriting the assessment and, of course, adding all the new information which further supports the endangered status.
Great. Mark, I'd like to ask you if you can talk about why long-tailed macaques in particular are so valuable or so special to the biomedical research and testing industry.
Sure. Well, primates have been long sought after by the biomedical and pharmaceutical and toxicological industries, testing industries and research industries, because many people have thought over the years that they make the best models for research into human health conditions or the testing of pharmaceuticals or other products for human use, because, they're amongst our closest relatives, and that might intuitively seem quite logical. But I think there's increasing evidence that doesn't really support this. Unfortunately, this prevailing view that primates and some other species are essential for this kind of research and testing has resulted in legislation in some countries that actually requires products to be tested on animals. And so the biomedical and toxicological industries have ended up being committed to using these animals, and in some cases, in particular with long-tailed macaques in terms of primates, in vast numbers. And the animals can also fetch very high prices. This has created a whole industry around the production or collection and trade in this particular species and other species as well. And the animals can end up fetching very high prices. And this happened with long-tailed macaques, particularly since demand went through the roof and supply dwindled at the same time during the COVID-19 crisis. So there's lots of dealers and traders making a lot of money on the back of the trade in long-tailed macaques to supply the research and toxicological and testing industries with animals. I think long-tailed macaques in particular have been sought after because they're relatively easy to keep compared to some other primate species. They're relatively straightforward to breed in captivity and handle. The industry used to prefer rhesus macaques years ago, but sort of switched to long-tailed macaques when, as Malene indicated, particularly India banned rhesus macaque exports in the late 1970s in response to real concerns that these animals were just getting hoovered out of the wild in enormous numbers and creating a conservation issue. Now, the testing industries generally prefer captive bred animals, and they prefer captive bred animals because they can be more predictable genetically than wild caught animals, and they can be, in theory anyway, can be bred in conditions where you can produce what are called specific pathogen-free animals, so that the sort of health status of those animals can be more consistent and predictable. However, the rising demand, particularly in response to the COVID-19 crisis, when there was a huge focus in terms of vaccine development and research into COVID-19 and how to obviously deal with the situation in people, which created a huge spike in demand for long-tailed macaques, and happened at the same time that countries that used to supply macaques in large numbers to the international research and testing industries like China stopped exporting these animals for various reasons. This created a huge demand, which the captive breeding industry for long-tailed macaques couldn't meet over the short term. And I think this resulted in a big increase in offtake of animals from the wild, partly to stock breeding farms, but also to launder wild-caught animals through those breeding farms into trade by traders and traffickers who stood to make a lot of money out of this. So, we've sort of created a rod for our own backs through created huge demand for these animals because of this sort of ongoing prevailing view among many in industry that we need to use animals, and particularly primates that are relatively closely related to us, as models for research and testing for products that will ultimately have human use. Although, as I say, there's increasing evidence to suggest that animals and even animals that are quite closely related to us don't make particularly good models for human research and testing, and that there are other non-animal methods, methods that don't require live animals that are actually much more accurate and can be much more useful going forward.
Can I add to that also it seems like one of the reasons why long-tailed macaques were chosen after rhesus was also the easy access. So as we've talked about, really not much protection and not much enforcement. So the easy access also probably playing a part in this as well.
Okay, thank you both. So the subject of this particular podcast isn't the ethics of using primates as subjects. And so it's a huge subject, which is important, but we're not going to go too far into it here. But I do want to talk a little bit about the impact on individuals of all of this, because I think the impact on an individual who is used as a subject of research or whatever is fairly obviously big. But what about those who are caught from the wild? What happens to the group members that are still left in the wild, for example? Because I feel like one aspect of all of this that is not often acknowledged is the disruption that is caused to the remaining members of the social group when animals are wild caught. Can either of you speak about that for a moment?
Sure, I can kick off if you like. Long-tailed macaques are highly intelligent and highly social animals, and they do live in quite large social groups, and those social groups are complicated. My own experience working in Thailand with long-tailed macaques that were rescued, usually from illegal trade or because they'd been raised and kept as pets or whatever, is that you realize very quickly how complex these animals are, and how the individual relationships between individual animals within a group can be very complex and can define the success or otherwise of the group. We were involved at the rescue centre in trying to create, if you like, artificial groups of animals that could live together from the animals that were rescued, usually rescued as individuals. And it's really, really complicated. We can't just assume that you can throw, a bunch of long-tailed macaques that have never seen each other before into a large enclosure or whatever and assume that they're all going to get on, because they don't. They're like people. They get on with some of their group mates. They don't get on with others. Some can be excluded. Some can be bullied. There are movements of animals between groups. It's really, really complex. And so you can imagine the disruption and distress that can be caused when people go in and just sort of randomly remove a number of animals from within a group. That's going to have huge impacts on the dynamics within that group and can be very, very disruptive. And in some circumstances can actually exacerbate issues such as human-wildlife conflict, because you disrupt the social cohesion and stability of groups of animals that may be living relatively close to people, and you can change the behavior of those animals can change as a result. So when you take animals out of their social groups, it's not only the stress and distress that's caused to those individual animals that are taken out and whatever might subsequently happen to them that we should be thinking about. It's also, the disruption to the social cohesion and the culture of the remaining animals in the group. Bear in mind as well that when animals are taken from the wild or bred in captivity, often the people who are taking those animals are after infants and young, and they will often remove those infants from their parents, from their mothers, at an earlier stage than they would normally separate in the wild. And that can also be incredibly distressing for those particular animals. And if they remain in the social group, that can also have a knock-on effect for the social cohesion of the group as a whole. We're just beginning to scratch the surface in terms of I believe, in terms of our understanding of culture and social complexity within animal groups. I think primates are one of the taxa that we're beginning to learn a little bit more about. But culture and social complexity is a really important consideration, and should be a really important consideration when we're considering how to protect animals and design conservation programs. We can't just think of these things in terms of numbers of animals anymore. We need to think about the implications for social and cultural cohesion within those animal groups if we're going to successfully conserve and protect these animals and the roles that they play in their wider ecosystems.
I definitely support everything Mark said. In terms of the capture, normally, I would say, which is just horrible to say normally, but as Mark said, you usually see that they take young infants and juveniles, which just creates an insane instability in the group, as Mark also discussed. But what we've seen over the past couple of years is that there's been a targeting towards females. So because these breeding centers have had to ramp up their production, I guess, of long-tailed macaques, so producing offspring quite fast, they've targeted females for the breeding centers to really get them to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And we know now that, especially for long-tailed macaques, they have a matrilineal hierarchy, and removing the females who are the stable core of these social groups definitely creates enormous instability. Also, we've recently worked with the IUCN Conservation Planning Specialist Group in creating a population viability analysis for the long-tailed macaque, and it clearly shows that when you extract females from these groups, they decline rapidly. They become extirpated, simply. So this has severe knock-on effects. And then, of course, when an entire group then is removed from an ecosystem, all of the roles that it provided for that ecosystem is removed as well. And also, Mark, commented our culture. We are working very hard on documenting the different cultural behaviors of long-tailed macaques, that, they are tool users. They play with stones. They do so many things. They hunt with tools. They do so many intricate, interesting things. And when you remove a group, you might be actually making a certain cultural behavior or culture become extinct. And often you'll see that females are very innovative and on the front line of some of these cultural behaviors. And then removing them, for example, if you remove the individuals that are performing the behavior, then that behavior is not going to be transmitted through the group and will not sustain in the group. So there's so many different considerations. And then the last one is that what we've also seen, because they just desperately need macaques and they're exporting wild caughts, is that they will go in and capture an entire group. So everyone, so they do donut hunting, as they call it. They go out at night and then they just take down all of the trees that are surrounding the sleeping trees. They put a net over the sleeping trees and then just catch all of the different individuals, and then they can send them off. So we're actually seeing entire groups being removed. That's, again, the effects on just that ecosystem, then missing that entire group, but also missing all of those trees that are being felled for this capture. That then has knock-on effects on all of the different individuals in that ecosystem. And then again, we're also finding that long-tail macaques are starting to co-create cultures with humans, or have done quite for a long time. But we're just kind of starting to recognize all of these different intricate behaviors and how humans and animals actually cooperate and communicate. So when we remove species, that also gets lost. And as Mark also said, then that can actually create further conflicts and misunderstandings. We've, for example, also seen them with translocations of these macaques. When you move them from one area where they have a relationship with the local community and where there is understanding, you move them to a different area where they all of a sudden have to figure out, okay, where do I live? Where do I forage? Then there's not that relationship with the new community, and that creates further conflicts from both sides, from the humans and the monkeys, that they don't understand each other because they don't have the history of communication. So, massive effects.
Yeah. I don't suppose when a country sets a quota of, the number of long-tailed macaques that can be sustainably taken per year, I don't suppose that mentions anything about exactly who these individuals are, what their age is, what their sex is, whether it's a whole group, whether it's just parts of the group. Is there anything like that normally included in such a thing?
I think I've only seen amount of individuals on a capture quota, but there might be outside. That's just a list. So maybe there are some other requirements that are not on the list. I can't say for sure.
Well, moving towards the end of our recording, how can we, people who work on behalf of animals, people who just care about animals, people who care about the environment, about cultures, about all of the stuff we've been talking about, how can we work together to protect the species, to protect humans, to protect individuals from harm that could be avoided? What can we all do together to make this situation better?
I think there's a few things. It's really important that people understand that while these animals may appear to be widespread, they are disappearing fast from vast areas of their range in Asia. And the work that Malene and her colleagues are doing is so important in demonstrating this and making people realize this species isn't as abundant as people might think, just because they happen to be fairly visible in some human-dominated landscapes. The fact that they prefer the forest fringes and adapt well to human-dominated areas makes them appear so much more common than they are, and as we've said, in many instances, they're seen as pests. We need to encourage coexistence between macaques and people, something the Long-tailed Macaque Project, I know, is working on in parts of Asia, and to implement ways of mitigating conflict without just killing animals or allowing them to be captured in huge numbers, to be either stocked in breeding farms or laundered into trade, as we've said. And certainly when it comes, there is also trade in long-tailed macaques for pets. They don't make good pets. People think they will because the infants are very cute and cuddly and so on, but they don't make good pets. So we would urge people not to seek to try and own a long-tailed macaque and avoid liking or following people who post videos or content online involving long-tailed macaques or other wild animals for that matter in their homes, however innocuous or cute that content might appear to be, because it's often incredibly misleading. And I know the Asia for Animals is doing a lot of work on social media animal cruelty content through some of its working groups, a lot of really good work to raise awareness there. And we need the biomedical and toxicological industries that currently use these animals in such huge numbers and the governments that regulate them to recognise the importance of applying the principles of the 3 R's, replacing, reducing and refining animal use in research, and to look to phase out the use of macaques and other primates and other live animals. Ultimately, it's only through reducing and eliminating demand that we can truly end the trade. So we'd urge people to help by doing whatever they can to raise awareness, to, sign the petitions, to write to their governments, whatever, and, to choose products that haven't been tested on animals wherever possible. We have here in the UK, the Leaping Bunny logo on a lot of products that haven't been animal tested. And as we've already indicated, much of this animal testing is increasingly recognised as being not really fit for purpose. And so it's something that we really need the public to be aware of and to help to phase out.
Yes, and I think that one of the things to enable to do this is that we all need to be aware of what the requirements for testing are currently. Mark mentioned it earlier that, that there is this requirement to test on animals that needs to be removed. Like the FDA did with the Modernization Act, saying that you do not have to test on animals before you test on humans. So there are a lot of other options now that we need to implement. And in the EU, there's still the 2-species rule that you have to test on a rodent and a non-rodent, and that needs to be removed as well. We need to realize that a lot of possibilities are available out there, and they need to be employed. So we need to remove constraints. I'm not saying that everything can be tested on non-animal methods because that's not my expertise, so I cannot. But I can say that if we remove some of the constraints, there's definitely a possibility to reduce. And we need to seek that possibility. And I think all of the MPs in the EU need to work towards that. And then also we need to hold, especially as Mark said, the social media companies, they need to be held accountable. They need to be responsible. They need to take action against what's going on out there. It shouldn't be possible to exploit animals online in that way. And people need to be aware of that. I do see people, sharing. They're like, oh, look at this. They're so nice. They're rescuing this primate from drowning. Oh, they put that primate in the water. Though all of those fake videos, people need to realize they are fake videos. It's exploitation. It's abuse. And we cannot support it.
And every comment and every share makes it more profitable and makes it more likely that more of those will be created in the future also. Yeah,
definitely. So we can report. That's what we can do. Then also, I think there's a necessity to change the discourse around all of this. We keep talking about that, animals are natural when they are in the natural forest. And then it's unnatural when you're a human and you're in a city. That's just not the case anymore. I mean, it has not ever been. There's no such thing as unnatural and natural and wild and feral and all of these different words that people are using. We need to stop using those words, and we need to just think about, what is this animal? Where does this animal live? Where does it want to live? What is the agency of this animal? The choices, all of these things. We need to consider that in our actions and in our conservation measures. And humans and animals can coexist. It might not be peaceful, but it's a possibility, and it has occurred for a long time. So that's what we need to consider. So working in the interfaces instead of deleting the interfaces and separating animals and humans. And then also, I think there's a huge need here to collaborate. We're trying to do this constantly. It's very difficult, but I think that there seems to be some entities that are trying to stop conservationists and animal welfare practitioners to collaborate with people that are in the laboratories. There seems to be some entities in between, might be entities that are earning a lot of money from keeping us apart. But I think that we need to work together. So conservationists, animal welfare practitioners, and people that work in laboratories with animals need to sit down and talk about what's actually going on. From the field, we know things about the supply chains that they need to know, and that communication must not be stopped. And what I'm finding right now is that there's a huge push to reduce the credibility of what we are producing to be able to continue the supply of long-tailed macaques to the laboratories. And that is a huge issue. I have great faith in everyone wanting to do the best for all animals, also the people that test on them in the laboratories. They're also humans and with great empathy. And I think that once information is shared and we can collaborate and we can discuss together, there is a better way forward.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Do you have any final words, either of you, before we say goodbye?
I think just one thing to say is, we just taking us back to earlier in the conversation, Malene talked in great detail, and she's, very much the expert on this, how the process of arriving at the endangered listing for long-tailed macaques happened and what that means. And we talked about how that endangered listing in and of itself is designed to inform policymakers and inform the wider public about the plight of long-tailed macaques and the trajectory of long-tailed macaques as a species and populations within that species. But that listing in and of itself doesn't mean that the species automatically gets additional protection. Additional protection and the mechanisms for dealing with human-wildlife conflict and so forth, these are political decisions ultimately and social decisions. And that's where people who say, well, this is awful, but what can I do about it? Well, there are things that we can do about it. There are things we can all do by expressing our concerns and trying to influence our decision makers and politicians, whether we're in a long-tailed macaque range state where perhaps the animals huge numbers are being taken from the wild or culled or whatever, or whether we're in countries in Europe or North America where they're using these animals in research and creating the demand that's resulting in this enormous trade. We can all do something. We can all go to our decision makers, our politicians, our representatives, and say, we're really concerned about this and we think that we need to change the trajectory and give far greater protections to these animals before we lose them altogether.
And can I just add a bit to that? That not only is this a problem for the animals, it's a problem for humans, because with so many wild-caught individuals going into the testing, going into the breeding, there is a great risk of disease transmission. There's also a great risk that the results from the testing cannot be trusted because we have no idea of the history of these animals, their immune responses, everything. There are just a lot of things to consider here. So it's not only really bad for the species, it's also really bad for humans, and humans are at great risk through all of this. We need to, start to communicate about these risks.
Malene and Mark, thank you so much for the conversation today. It was really interesting, and it's always good to hear in detail about the worlds that you work in and all of this interesting detail about long-tailed macaques. I know that our listeners will enjoy it too. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us, Brooke.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. You can find everything you need to know about our work and connect with us at asiaforanimals.com. Tune in for the next episode. Asia for Animals Coalition, a united voice for Asia's animals.